It began with a rumor that slithered through the marble corridors of Rome like incense smoke, sweet and poisonous, whispering that the gods had returned in the body of a boy. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, known to history as Elagabalus, but to those who saw him beneath the gilded canopy of the Palatine, he was something more than mortal, something impossible. Born in the sun-scorched Syrian city of Emesa, heir to a priesthood older than the empire itself, he carried within his slender frame the blood of kings and the secrets of gods. His family's deity was Elagabal, the black conical stone that shimmered with iron and mystery. And when the empire's soldiers, weary of civil war, lifted the boy to the throne at 14, they did not know they were crowning not merely an emperor, but a living incarnation of ecstasy. Rome, bloated by its own victories, was ready for madness disguised as divinity. The Senate, gray with tradition, tried to look away when the youth entered the city wearing silk robes embroidered with suns, his face painted with crimson dust, his eyes outlined in kohl, his voice soft and melodic as he declared himself the bride of the sun. In that moment, the empire's marble heart cracked, and through it seeped a fever of identity, pleasure, and despair that would drown its capital in perfume and blood alike. Those who served him said that the palace changed scent every hour. Myrrh at dawn, jasmine by dusk, musk by midnight, as if the walls themselves were breathing desire. Elagabalus spoke of unity between male and female, between priest and lover, between God and worshiper. To his mind, Rome's rigid binaries were a disease to be healed, and he would be the medicine. He ordered new rituals where men wore veils and women bore swords, where senators knelt before slaves dressed as angels, and where the emperor himself, dressed in gold and linen, danced barefoot before the sacred stone as drums thundered and flutes wept. To the devout Romans, it was blasphemy. To those who had lost faith in marble gods and hollow victories, it was revelation. The boy emperor's beauty became a legend, his skin pale as milk, his hair dark and scented with oil, his movements so graceful that even his critics confessed he seemed carved from desire itself. Yet behind the elegance lay a restlessness that no worship could soothe. He began to change himself, not just in costume, but in essence. Ancient chroniclers, half fascinated, half horrified, wrote that he longed to be a woman, that he offered gold to any physician who could craft him one. He called himself the Lady of the Empire, took lovers among gladiators, slaves, and senators alike, and demanded that his subjects address him as she. In her eyes, gender was theater, and the stage was Rome itself. She turned the palace into a temple of transformation, rooms draped in silk, floors scattered with petals, fountains spilling not water, but rose wine. At night, torches flickered through translucent curtains while the air shimmered with the sound of zithers and laughter. Guests entered through corridors lined with mirrors so that they might see themselves 1,000 times and forget which reflection was true. The emperor would appear from behind a screen, face veiled, voice trembling like a prayer asking, "Who among you dares to see me as I am?" And when the veil fell, they did not see a man or a woman, but something that defied language, a being sculpted by its own defiance. Yet beneath the gold and fragrance was fear. Every empire that forgets its gods invents new ones, and every ruler who becomes divine courts destruction. Elagabalus, intoxicated by her own myth, began to treat Rome's traditions as playthings. She married a charioteer, then a gladiator, then a woman of noble birth, each union dissolving not by law but by whim. She proclaimed herself both husband and wife, priest and bride, sun and moon. The Senate fumed, the Praetorians murmured, and the people watched the spectacle with the morbid delight of those who sense an ending. The feasts grew stranger, banquets where dishes were sculpted to resemble organs of the body, where guests reclined on cushions filled with air so that they burst mid-meal, spilling dinos into laughter and wine, where hundreds of exotic animals roamed the halls, painted and perfumed. Yet even in this chaos, there was method, a desperate search for meaning. The boy who had once prayed before a sacred stone now tried to sculpt a new faith out of flesh and sensation. "If the gods made me in error," he is said to have whispered, "I shall correct their mistake." And so began his transformation, not only of Rome, but of himself. He summoned healers, magicians, and eunuchs from the farthest provinces, demanding they alter his body to match his soul. He wore corsets of woven gold to narrow his waist, bathed in pearl dust to soften his skin, and practiced the gait of priestesses. Each day, another piece of the emperor vanished into the goddess he imagined. Yet the empire was not built for such metamorphosis. Its marble virtues, discipline, conquest, masculinity, shuddered beneath the weight of his revolution. Soldiers mocked him as the she-emperor. Poets wrote satires that dripped with both fascination and disgust, and whispers crept even into the barracks, that the gods were angry, that Rome's victories had curdled into decadence. But the emperor refused to repent. Instead, he decreed that Elagabal, his Syrian sun god, would replace Jupiter as Rome's supreme deity. A massive temple rose on the Palatine, its roof open to the sky so that sunlight might fall directly upon the black meteorite. At its dedication, the emperor appeared not in armor, but in bridal silk, leading the sacred stone through the streets in a golden chariot drawn by naked slaves. The crowd gasped, half in awe, half in terror, as he proclaimed, "The sun has taken me as his wife." In that single proclamation, he married East and West, male and female, god and mortal, and sealed his doom. Rome could forgive cruelty, even madness, but not blasphemy that mocked its identity. The senators who once bowed now plotted, the Praetorians who once guarded now conspired. Yet still, within the palace, nights burned like constellations. The emperor's lovers multiplied. Boxers, dancers, poets, each adored and discarded like perfumes fading at dawn. He built chambers where ceilings rained petals until guests suffocated beneath their fragrance. He hosted lotteries where winners received estates and losers their death. To some, it was lunacy. To others, genius. For beneath the excess shimmered a philosophy. That pleasure was the only truth left in a dying world. The empire, vast and exhausted, fed on illusions of order. Elagabalus tore them down with laughter. He dared to ask what no emperor had. What if power itself were performance? What if identity were art? In the candlelit mirrors of his palace, senators and courtesans saw themselves reflected not as Romans, but as actors in a divine farce. Yet every play must end. Beyond the marble walls, famine crept through the provinces, soldiers went unpaid, and faith decayed like old incense. Rumors grew that the boy emperor sacrificed children, that he drowned his enemies in perfume, that he turned senators into concubines. Most were lies, yet they spread faster than truth ever could. The Praetorian Guard, disgusted and hungry, began to whisper the name of another, Alexander, a cousin younger and more obedient, a puppet wrapped in virtue. Julia Maisa, the emperor's cunning grandmother, who had once placed him on the throne, now saw that her creation had become uncontrollable. Power, like perfume, grows sickly when overused. She began to plot quietly, promising the guard gold and stability if they would transfer their loyalty. Inside the palace, Elagabalus sensed the shifting winds, but mistook them for jealousy. "They hate me," he said, "because I am what they dare not be." And perhaps he was right. His defiance of gender and divinity was too vast for an empire built on conquest. The final days were a masquerade of denial. The emperor continued to host feasts, dressing as Venus one night, Mars the next, as if costume could shield him from fate. Lightning storms lashed the city, temples cracked, and the priests murmured that the sun god himself had turned its face away. Yet even as omens multiplied, the emperor danced, his voice rising over thunder. The sun never abandons his bride. It was both a prayer and a curse. On the last morning of his reign, the palace smelled of lavender and iron. The praetorians arrived under the guise of ceremony, armor glinting in the weak dawn light. The emperor, draped in silk, greeted them with a smile, unaware that the gods had chosen silence. Within hours, chaos erupted. Soldiers stormed the halls, servants screamed, mirrors shattered. Elagabalus fled through corridors that had once echoed with music, now filled with the clang of swords. He sought sanctuary in the temple of his son, clutching the meteorite idol as if it could still protect him. Some say he prayed, others that he laughed. When the guards broke through, they found not a warrior, but a vision. A youth in bridal robes, eyes lined in kohl, blood on his lips, whispering, "Tell them the bride has returned to her husband." They dragged him from the altar, his silks tearing like wings. On the steps where he had once danced, he was struck down. The sun, that indifferent witness, burned through the clouds as if to seal the scene in eternity. The body of the emperor, who had called himself woman, was cast into the Tiber, denied burial, denied name. And yet, centuries later, the ripples of that life still shimmer. For Elagabalus did what few dared. He turned identity into empire, desire into doctrine, and death into a form of freedom. Rome, in killing him, confessed its own fear, that beneath every statue of order lies a trembling truth, and beneath every empire's armor a longing to be something else. As the river carried his body toward the city exhaled, a sigh of relief, or perhaps of loss. The age of divine excess was over. The age of shadows had begun. Yet in the ruins of palaces and the fragments of marble reliefs, the whisper endures, that once the sun married a boy who became a bride, and for a brief burning moment, Rome learned what it meant to worship transformation itself. The river did not care whom it carried. Beneath the bronze bridges of Rome, where shadows of statues trembled upon the current, the body of the boy emperor drifted silently toward the sea. Fishermen who glimpsed it at dawn swore they saw the sun shimmer on the water as if reluctant to let him go, as though Helios himself wept for his lost bride. By decree of the Senate, no tomb was to bear his name, no flame to honor his soul. But the Romans had long forgotten that memory is a rebel god, immune to laws and purges. Within days, gossip rose from the gutters like incense. Women whispered that they had dreamt of a pale figure walking across the Tiber, pearls dissolving in his hair, calling them to freedom. Slaves left offerings of flowers where the current turned gold. Even soldiers, hardened by wars in distant provinces, muttered that strange lights flickered above the water at night, as if the boy they had slain refused to stay dead. Yet while the city gossiped, the Senate labored to erase him. His portraits were smashed, his coins melted, his name scraped from inscriptions. Statues that once gleamed in courtyards were thrown into furnaces until the marble cracked and screamed. The historians of the age, Cassius Dio, Herodian, the chroniclers of power, dipped their quills not in ink, but in poison, transforming the emperor into a monster of decadence. They wrote that he drowned guests in perfume, that he fed lions on the entrails of virgins, that he turned the sacred halls into brothels of madness. Lies? Exaggerations? Perhaps. But truth rarely survives empire, and history is always written by the victors, and by those too afraid to love what they killed. In the years that followed, Rome sought to forget. His cousin Alexander Severus was crowned emperor, a boy of discipline and modesty, tutored by philosophers, dressed in armor rather than silk. The city exhaled relief. The priests scrubbed the altars clean, and the Senate declared that moral order had been restored. Yet beneath that fragile calm, something had shifted. Rome could not look at its own reflection without seeing the ghost of the one it murdered. In the quiet of night, the courtesans of Subura painted their eyes with kohl and called it divine fashion. Gladiators began to wear amulets shaped like the black stone of Emesa. Even the philosophers, in their candle-lit studies, debated the nature of self, whether identity was flesh or spirit, costume or confession. Elagabalus, though erased, had become contagion, his name unspeakable, yet his influence inescapable. He was gone, and yet he remained, like the scent of perfume long after the wearer has vanished. The empire itself, vast and glittering, had entered its age of mirrors. Once, Rome had been a machine of conquest. Now, it was an actor reciting lines it no longer believed. The legions marched, but their loyalty was thin. The temples burned oil, but the gods no longer listened. And in that vacuum of meaning, the story of the boy emperor became a secret gospel whispered by those who had nothing left to worship. Some said he was a warning, the price of too much pleasure. Others said he was a prophecy, a soul born centuries too early. To the slaves who dreamed of freedom, he was proof that even the mighty could defy the mold. To the women trapped in arranged marriages, he was the goddess who dared to choose her lovers. To the soldiers stationed in foreign deserts, he was the mad sun that burned too brightly and too brief. Centuries later, the Christians would rise, preaching humility and repentance. They too would call him abomination, their sermons dripping with the same fear that once filled the Senate. But the irony was divine, for even as they condemned him, they imitated him. The cathedrals they built glowed with the same incense and gold he adored. Their saints and martyrs wore the same tears of ecstasy. Their virgins spoke of bridal union with God. The emperor who had married the sun had unknowingly written the first chapter of a new religion, one that would also sanctify transformation, though under a different name. Time, ever the patient sculptor, softened the outlines of his infamy. In the ruins of Palatine Hill, wildflowers sprouted through marble floors once slick with wine. Travelers from the east would pause among the stones, feeling something electric in the air, as if the past still vibrated beneath their feet. Artists of the Renaissance, centuries later, would uncover his portrait, the face delicate, almost feminine, the eyes haunted and proud. And they would argue, was he a monster or a muse? Some painted him as Apollo's lost child, others as a warning against vanity. Yet none could deny his magnetism. Even erased, he had become eternal. For what truly dies when it has been myth? The Romans who drowned him believed they were killing scandal. Instead, they created symbol. His life became the riddle that every civilization faces at its peak. How much truth can we bear before we destroy it? Elagabalus dared to live as both emperor and bride, god and human man and woman, and for that, Rome crucified him not on a cross, but in its memory. Every age that followed would rediscover him in a different mask. In the courts of the French kings, where men powdered their faces and women wore the power of monarchs, his spirit whispered through the candlelight. In the palaces of the Ottomans, where eunuchs guarded harems and boys were adorned in silk, his ghost lingered in the corridors. Even in the salons of Victorian London, where gender was spoken of in hush and scandal, artists invoked him as the forbidden muse, the one who blurred the lines between beauty and sin. The historians never forgave him, but the poets never forgot him. They saw in his story not corruption, but courage. For what is courage, if not the defiance of the body's prison? The emperor who danced before the sun had glimpsed a truth Rome could not yet name. That identity is not inherited, but created. And though he paid for it with his life, he won something rarer than victory. He won remembrance. Imagine him now, not as the caricature of decadence carved by his enemies, but as a vision rising through the mist of centuries, a figure half light, half shadow, standing at the threshold of time. The silk of his robes has turned to dust, but the spirit within them still flickers like a candle refusing extinction. Around him swirl echoes of laughter, music, whispers, fragments of an empire that mistook his rebellion for madness. He looks toward the horizon, where Rome once stood, now only ruins, and he smiles. I told them, his ghost might say, that the sun never abandons its bride, and perhaps the sun never did. Each dawn over the ancient city carries his memory, the light pouring across the Tiber like molten gold, the same river that once carried his corpse. Tourists walk the bridges unaware that beneath their feet glides a story too radiant for marble. Every glint on the water is a fragment of him. Every echo in the forum a note from his vanished songs. In this way, he reigned still, not from a throne, but from eternity's reflection. Rome, for all its might, could not comprehend that identity is the truest empire. Its legions conquered lands. His soul conquered time. When historians speak of decadence, they think of orgies and excess. But decadence is merely honesty without shame. The moment a civilization looks into its mirror and cannot decide whether it sees God or beast. Elagabalus was that mirror. He showed Rome itself, beautiful, monstrous, yearning to be more than human. And for that revelation, they killed him. Yet in killing him, they condemned themselves to haunt their own perfection. 1,000 years later, when the empire's stones had crumbled and its language turned to relic, a monk copying manuscripts by candlelight found a name that had been struck out and rewritten. He hesitated, dipped his quill, and restored it. Elagabalus. In that small act of defiance, memory resurrected the forbidden sun. From that moment, his story began to rise again, in the poems of decadence, in the dreams of artists, in the questions of philosophers who dared to ask, what is a man? What is a woman? And what lies between? The modern world, with all its science and screens, still stands in his shadow. Every parade that celebrates freedom, every voice that claims the right to be seen, carries a spark of that Syrian boy who once danced before Rome and declared himself divine. He would have laughed to see how the future still wrestles with the same fear, the terror of difference. And perhaps he would have pitied us for taking centuries to understand what he knew in his brief blaze, that the body is only a costume and the soul is infinite. In the museum halls where fragments of his reign are displayed, a coin with a faint profile, a broken relief, a piece of gold thread from a robe, visitors linger longer than they intend. They cannot explain why. There is something magnetic about the lost emperor, something unsettling, yet tender. It is the same feeling that haunted his city, fascination tinged with guilt. For deep down, humanity recognizes itself in him, its vanity, its yearning, its hunger to transcend. History often reduces rebellion to scandal, but every scandal hides a sermon. Elagabalus's sermon was written not in scripture but in silk and blood. It said, "To live truthfully is to risk everything." Few have lived it so completely. His reign lasted barely 4 years, yet it changed Rome more profoundly than a century of wars. After him, emperors would never again claim divinity so easily. Religion would turn inward, morality would become obsession, and identity, once an afterthought, would become destiny. In the end, his greatest revenge was survival through metaphor. The Christians made him a devil. The artists made him a muse. The historians made him a myth. But the truth is simpler and more dangerous. He was a mirror, and mirrors, once broken, multiply the image they were meant to destroy. Every fragment reflects a different face. The soldiers, the courtesans, the poets, the outcasts, all glimpsing themselves in the boy who dared to become everything. If you listen closely, in the ruins of the Palatine, when the wind moves through the cypress trees, you might hear a faint sound, not weeping, not laughter, but something between the two. It is the sound of a world remembering what it tried to forget. It is the breath of the boy who turned himself into legend. The sun dips low, the sky burns crimson, and the stones glow as if lit from within. For one eternal instant, the city seems alive again, bathed in the same impossible light that once crowned its most forbidden emperor. And in that glow, history whispers the line that no decree could erase. The bride of the sun still dances,